Welcome to a Voices of Esalen archive edition. I'm Sam Stern. Today I'm pleased to bring you an interview with the godfather of psychedelic psychotherapy, Stan Grof. This interview was conducted at the Esalen Institute on August 5, 1985 by a young Perry Holloman. Perry, of course, is a well-known figure at Esalen himself, having become over the course of his career an accomplished bodyworker and a beloved Gestalt therapist. Perry has his own episode on this podcast, which I'd encourage you to check out. During this recording, he and Stan investigate the emergent tendencies of transpersonal psychology, touching upon the non-ordinary states of consciousness which Grof is well known for, as well as Jungian archetypes and the concept of synchronicity. They also go into the deep connection between Freudianism and Newtonian thinking and discuss how new discoveries in quantum physics have affected other scientific disciplines, including psychology. It's a superb discussion conducted by two very smart people, and by its end, you too will have an enhanced understanding of why transpersonal psychology became an appropriate container for psychedelic psychotherapy, and indeed any therapy that seeks to go beyond personal biography and delve into the realm of the spiritual and the mystic.
By way of introduction, my name is Perry Holloman. Today I have the privilege of interviewing Dr. Stan Grof on the issue of transpersonal psychology. Stan has been a scholar in residence at the Esalen Institute for the last 10 years. And in addition to having been the chief of psychiatric research at the Maryland Institute of Psychology, he has been involved since his medical training in Czechoslovakia in researching the relationship between hallucinogenic substances and their effect upon the psyche. Stan, sort of by way of beginnings for setting a framework for what we'll be talking about today, I'd like to begin by posing two questions and letting you sort of organize them in the way you see fit. First, I would like to sort of establish an historical perspective through which the evolution of transpersonal psychology can be seen, beginning in terms of Freudian psychoanalysis, moving on to the expansions upon that system created by Carl Jung, as well as focusing on some of the major developments within psychology in this country, behaviorism, onto the Gestalt paradigm, then taking a look at modern cognitive approaches, and how they all fit in to an understanding of the beginnings of the transpersonal paradigm. So that's one question. The second question is it possible to delineate an actual structure for consciousness within the transpersonal paradigm? In other words, Freud talked about the unconscious, the preconscious, and the conscious mind, and subdivisions within those categories. Carl Jung talked about the persona and the ego, the shadow, the anima, the animus, and the self. So is there anything like that within the transpersonal paradigm?
Okay, well, I think I'll start with the history.
Okay.
I think the best way to do it is to go back and describe somewhat the context out of which humanistic and then later transpersonal psychology emerged. And this takes you to about the middle of this century, where the academic psychiatry was pretty much dominated by two major forces or movements, and that was behaviorism and Freudian psychoanalysis. But there was also a kind of increasing dissatisfaction in a subgroup of professionals with what behaviorism and psychoanalysis had to offer, not necessarily in terms of practical application, but in terms of the claims of these two systems to be kind of all-encompassing or exhaustive descriptions of the human being, the human psyche. It was Abraham Maslow who became a kind of prominent critic and spokesman of this movement. He offered a very kind of incisive critique of behaviorism, particularly the fact that behaviorism somehow derived all its or most of its information from experiments in animals such as rats and pigeons, and try to extrapolate into areas which it really did not directly explore in in any way. And it focused on aspects which we somehow share with animals, but it did never really address or study directly some of the aspects of human beings which are specifically human. And he also offered a critique of psychoanalysis, particularly the fact that psychoanalysis was somehow reducing again the psyche to base instincts. That it focused on the pathological populations. It derived all its information from neurotic or psychotic patients, and was totally neglecting what Maslow called the growing tip of the population.
Mm-hmm. Can you be more specific about what he meant by that, the growing tip of the population?
People who were functioning well, or who are what he called self-actualizing, self-realizing beings, creative people, and so on. You see that it was selectively drawing on the information from the study of psychopathology and sort of therapeutic work with people who have a lot of problems. So Maslow became very close with Anthony Suttich, and the two of them somehow launched the group of others who were not as central to this effort. They launched a new movement in psychology, which they called Humanistic psychology, and they also created a journal of humanistic psychology. And the basic objective here was to humanize psychology, as the name suggests, bringing back somehow the interest in introspective data, which behaviorism has totally neglected. So some of its extreme forms, behaviorism would like to do psychology without referring to consciousness, just from the study, sort of analysis of behavior.
Didn't behaviorism actually implicitly deny the existence of consciousness within its narrow constructs, and that it saw the psyche as a clean slate upon the birth of every individual, and that the psyche was simply constructed out of stimulus-response associations?
That's right. Just sort of reflects neurological activity, and they didn't see any really qualitative difference between animals and humans. It was just a question of complexity of these interacting reflexes, but there was no fundamental difference. And it's difficult to deny the fact of consciousness, but they didn't think that the data coming from introspection, from consciousness, would be of any relevance. They also emphasized that you should study organisms in order to be able to control them. In other words, the emphasis in behaviorism is to control the behavior of others. The extreme of it would be, of course, Skinner. Whereas what humanistic psychology emphasized was the introspective data, human objectives, but also sort of taking charge of your own inner process, actually using the psychological information to be able to control your own behavior, or sort of in terms of your own psychological processes.
How did the Gestaltists' emphasis upon perceptual mechanisms within the psyche affect both or create the, if you will, the downfall of behaviorism, and add to the formulation of more humanistic goals within the field of psychology?
I think Gestalt therapy is a very, very important development within humanistic psychology. It's one of the many different approaches for which humanistic psychology kind of provided a very broad umbrella. But I think Abe Maslow and Suttich, and Tony Suttich, they formulated somehow the principles of humanistic psychology pretty much independently. Fritz Perls came somehow much later, when the general framework for humanistic psychology was already established. So in any case, this was the basic principle, the basic innovation of humanistic psychology was the focus on the importance of introspective data, pursuit of human objectives, and also somehow emphasizing the purpose of psychological research, that it somehow should improve the human condition. So the concerns, societal concerns, were very important for humanistic psychology. Humanistic psychology became very, very popular, started gaining more and more momentum and became a real force in psychology. Abe Maslow actually called it a third force, following behaviorism and psychoanalysis as the first and the second force. But it didn't last more than maybe a decade at the most, when there was again increasing dissatisfaction within humanistic psychology, that even the kind of definition of psychology that was provided by humanistic psychologists did not really completely cover the totality of the human psyche. That there were still significant areas which were somehow left out within humanistic psychology, that was emphasizing sort of growth, human potential, self-actualization, self-realization, and so on. And this would be particularly in the broadest sense, that the spiritual dimension, which was left out in humanistic psychology. So suddenly there was increasing interest in the Eastern spiritual disciplines, in different systems of yoga, Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, or systems such as Kabbalah, for example. The professional interest was somehow directed towards these areas. And there was suddenly an awareness that there's a tremendous gap between the kind of treasures of knowledge that these ancient systems have to offer in terms of understanding of the human psyche, consciousness, human personality, and so on. That Western psychology, whether behaviorism, psychoanalysis, or humanistic psychology, have never even remotely addressed themselves to the very fundamental issues which have been explored by these ancient or Oriental psychological systems.
It seems, although that Carl Jung himself was interested in such issues at the time of his break, if you will, from Freudian psychoanalysis, and that he actually talked about Eastern mysticism and the importance of archetype and their symbolic representations within the psyche, as well as the concept of an inherited psychic tradition that one is born into in the world.
It's very much so, but I would like to leave Jung for a little later, because you see, at the time when we're talking about Jungian analysis, was not really, and still is not at present, part of the sort of mainstream academic psychiatry. And in a way, as we will see later, Jung has skipped somehow the phase of humanistic psychology. He jumped, right into what we can call transpersonal psychology. He was certainly the first transpersonal therapist, together with Roberto Assagioli, psychosynthesis. But at this time, psychosynthesis and Jungian analysis still were pretty separated from the mainstream development. So there was this increasing awareness that somehow for psychology to become really comprehensive and cover the totality of psyche, it has to include this emphasis on spirituality and different states of consciousness, evolution, and study things such as creativity, being, love, that has never been really adequately explored, and so on. And it was again Abraham Maslow and Tony Suttich who launched before humanistic psychology, who became really somehow the focus or the fulcrum of this new movement. And there was another development which was quite independent, and that was the development of psychedelic therapy, which I was very much part of, where it became very, very quickly obvious that the spiritual transpersonal dimension is extremely important. Or without any programming, people in psychedelic sessions would be entering the realms of death, rebirth experiences, of past life experiences, of mythological experiences, archetypal experiences, and so on, mystical, transcendental states. It was simply one person after another. When we were doing clinical work with LSD, working on specific problems, psychopathological symptoms that people brought into therapy, we were using LSD as a kind of catalyst for psychoanalysis. And as we were working on these issues, very, very soon most people would transcend the realm of biography that you would expect to be all there is in the psyche if you take psychoanalysis seriously. I mean, somehow the whole story underlying the various forms of psychopathology was supposed to be in childhood and certainly in postnatal history, whereas literally one patient after another would very quickly move beyond this sort of realm of childhood, would confront death, relive birth, and then connecting to the kinds of realms that have been described either in Jungian psychology or in these great spiritual philosophies, or what's called perennial philosophy. So it simply became obvious that these are very, very significant dimensions of the psyche. And to bring it to a little more personal note, when I came to the United States in 1967, I was already familiar with Esalen from a previous visit. I had been here in 1965 for a brief visit with Virginia Satir and met Fritz Perls, Dick Price, Mike Murphy, and other people. And so when I came to the United States, I made contact with Esalen, and while still working in the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, I was coming to do seminars, usually weekend seminars or 5-day seminars at Esalen. And I presented the material from the LSD work, and it was actually Paul Herbert, who was running the media center at Esalen, who told me, you know, although you're working with drugs, you sound just like Abraham Maslow. Abe Maslow had done his work on the so-called peak experiences, as he called it, people who have spontaneous mystical states, and he described in detail the impact that these experiences had on their personality, on their value system, and he actually developed a whole new psychology based on the observations from these mystical states. And I was not familiar with Maslow. You see, I came from Eastern Europe, where access to literature was extremely difficult. It was not like here, where everything was available. So I've never heard of Maslow. But it was at the instigation of Paul Herbert that I sent to Abraham Maslow a large manuscript, which I was just completing, summarizing the LSD work.
Was that Realms of the Human Unconscious?
No, this was like a pool of information, out of which about 3 of the books, later books, this has never been published. I decided to split it because it was just too voluminous, you know. So I sent it to him, and I got a very enthusiastic response from him, and he asked me to visit him in Boston, and so I came to visit him, and he was after a heart attack, and I met in the door his wife Bertha, who told me, as I was going to his room, that he was so excited by the data coming from psychedelic work that she had to give it to him only for a limited amount of time, because she was afraid that he could have another heart attack. The parallels between his material, the spontaneous mystical experiences, and the psychedelic work. So we became very close. And then very shortly afterwards he got this very special fellowship, and he moved from the East Coast to California, and I made several visits and met with this small group of people who were formulating the basis of transpersonal psychology. This was Tony Suttich, Abe Maslow, Jim Fadiman was part of that group, Sonia and Gabi Margulis, and a few other people. Viktor Frankl visited once. We all agreed that somehow it was time to launch a new movement in psychology, and Abe and Tony had the name for it. They wanted to call it Humanistic psychology. But then Tony heard my talk about the psychedelic work, where I referred to these experiences that come beyond biography and beyond the death rebirth process as transpersonal. And both Tony and Abe liked that term very much, so that finally that became the name of the new movement. It's really not a new word. It was used many years ago by Jung and then by Erich Neumann, but it just seemed to be the right name for this new psychology.
Mm-hmm. Maybe at this point then it would be appropriate to talk a little bit about Carl Jung, who was in many respects maybe the first of the transpersonal psychologists, because many of his concepts did directly involve the transcendence of personal biography in terms of the actual structure of the psyche, and also his emphasis upon the importance of archetypal forms and their symbolic representations within the psyche and within one's conscious manifestations of life.
Mm-hmm.
If you'd like
well,
to talk
I
a little
have
bit about
I
that.
have tremendous respect for what Jung established. I believe personally that what he contributed was as far beyond Freud as Freud was beyond psychiatry of his time, that it was really a quantum jump, and it took really decades to fully appreciate what Jung has contributed. Mm-hmm. I think the basic reason why it was so difficult was that what Freud contributed was extremely new within psychology, but he was very much really under the spell of Cartesian-Newtonian thinking, the Cartesian-Newtonian paradigm, as it is called.
As well as sort of the traditional medical model itself.
That's right.
He emphasized a lot, sort of almost the physiological, biochemical aspects of psychiatry.
You see, I worked with Fritjof Capra when he was writing The Turning Point. He had a number of consultants on this, and I was his consultant for psychology and psychotherapy. And one of my tasks was to go through Freudian psychoanalysis and study somehow relationship between Newton and Freud. And I found out that his major teacher, Ernst Brücke, was actually the founder of the so-called Helmholtz Society in Germany, which had a very explicit program to introduce the principles, the scientific principles of Newtonian mechanics into all the other disciplines, scientific disciplines, so that when Freud was writing his works, he was quite specifically, quite consciously, explicitly emulating Newton's thinking. So it's really very much ingrained somehow in the whole network of Newtonian thinking. And I think what was so significant for Jung was that he very, very painfully freed himself from that paradigm. He became aware of the fact that if he really considers seriously his own findings, that they are simply incompatible with the entire philosophy of Western science. And he connected with the group of people who were developing quantum physics, particularly Wolfgang Pauli, and he was interested in this sort of new scientific worldview that was emerging from physics, because he was aware of the fact that his findings simply don't make sense in the old framework.
Mm-hmm.
He also developed the very important concept of synchronicity, and it was actually during a meal with Albert Einstein when he got tremendous encouragement that he was on the right track and that he should pursue this kind of thinking because it was exactly paralleling the thinking of modern physicists.
Can you talk a little bit about that concept of synchronicity?
Well, what he found out in general is that in our life, you see sometimes very, very extraordinary events happen that seem to be meaningfully related, and that the accumulation of those events really is beyond any reasonable probabilities. He gave this very interesting example of a man who got for his birthday a very rare kind of plum pudding. And he liked it very much, and then for many years, that plum pudding was not part of his life until he came to Paris, to a restaurant, and suddenly he saw that on the menu there was the same very rare plum pudding. So he ordered the pudding, and the waiter came back with an apology. He said, "I'm sorry, we just gave the last one to the gentleman over there." And he turned, and there was the man who gave him the pudding in the first place. And then again, for many years, no pudding of that kind appeared in his life until he came to a party and they were serving the pudding. So he was eating the pudding. It says, all that is missing is the man who gave me the pudding in the first place and who then was in the French restaurant the second time when I came across this pudding. Suddenly there was a knocking on the door and this man came. He was totally confused. He was not even invited to this party. He was looking for something else, but he got the wrong number. Okay, so this would be Jung's example of synchronicity as such. Just very peculiar kind of accumulations of events where we cannot somehow really understand, how something like that could happen.
Yet but apparently there's a thread which is tying these seemingly unrelated events
obviously
together.
We're obviously missing some significant clues to understand those events. But what he was particularly interested in and what he became known for was a special example of synchronicity where it's not just synchronistic accumulation of some external events, but when such synchronicity occurs between the inner psychological process and external events. When, let's say, there would be a synchronicity between something that happens in your dream and what happens next day in your life.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel that implicit within that theory or hypothesis of synchronicity, whatever you would call it, there is the implication of an intelligent force within the universe which is binding together seemingly unrelated events on the conscious level?
I think that's a very plausible explanation. I don't know if it's the only one, but it certainly is a very, very plausible one that sort of certainly suggests itself. But I think what it indicates in any way is that events are influenced from some levels that are not available to our, the ordinary sort of conventional scientific scrutiny, that we're simply missing some very significant variables in our understanding of the world, that there are things that are coming from some kind of hidden dimensions, from fields that have not been described by mechanistic science.
Fields it almost seems like a good word in which to move on to the subject of quantum physics and how it sort of enhanced an understanding of this transcendence of biography within the field of psychology. It seems that Albert Einstein was always focusing upon attempting to find the basic building block within nature, which seems like a very Newtonian concept. And it seems that what quantum physics has suggested anyway is that there is no basic building block, or if there is a basic building block, it is something that exists almost on in an etheric realm, in which the basic particles within the atom seem to shift between being material, actual solid material particles, to just fields, magnetic fields, in which those particles cannot be seen. They seem to appear and disappear. How has that added to the transpersonal paradigm in your view? And is that an accurate interpretation, first of all, of some of what quantum physics has brought in?
I think it would be easier if I don't answer it directly, but I sort of go back a little to fill in a little bit of history, so that we get a continuity in the transpersonal movement. Because we ended really by the launching of transpersonal psychology, when also the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology was established, the California Institute of Transpersonal Psychology, and so on. But at that time, when suddenly transpersonal psychology became a discipline, it was still quite separate from the rest of science. It was sort of cohesive within itself, but it was very vulnerable to being called unscientific, irrational, because it did not connect with the Newtonian type of thinking. But then development started coming in from other disciplines, particularly the philosophical implications of quantum relativistic physics, things that were coming from systems and information theory, cybernetics, the work of Gregory Bateson, for example. Later, the developments in biology that culminated in Rupert Sheldrake's book, A New Science of Life, really sort of revolutionizing thinking in biology. The work of Arthur Young, his process theory that really synthesizes the findings in many different disciplines. More recently, Prigozhin's work, really powerful critique of the mechanistic thinking. See, so suddenly transpersonal type of thinking, or at least developments that seem to be congruent or convergent with transpersonal psychology, started emerging in other disciplines. So the transpersonal psychology was incompatible with the old Newtonian science, but it suddenly seemed to be perfectly compatible with all these new developments. It happened that books started appearing focusing on the fact that quantum physics, if taken seriously, points really to an entirely different worldview, that you cannot do what many physicists would like to do, and simply focus on the mathematical formalism, as it is called, and say we don't worry about the philosophical implications as long as we have an instrument that can predict the results of experiments. There are suddenly more and more people who are saying, wait a minute, I mean, you can't use this type of thinking, and which is entirely different, fundamentally different from the Newtonian thinking, uses some completely different principles, and believe that this does not have any serious philosophical implications, or that this does not have any implications for the worldview, scientific worldview. So those were the early books were books like Larry LeChan, The Medium, The Mystic, and The Physicist. It was showing the parallels between the mystical worldview and this new quantum relativistic worldview. He actually has one part when he juxtaposes passages from the texts of mystics and of modern physicists and lets you guess which is which, and it's frequently very, very difficult because of the parallels. There was another book called Space, Time and Beyond, which was Bob Tobin's book based on discussions with Fred Wolf and Jack Sarfati. And then particularly Fritjof's book, The Tao of Physics, I think, that became a bestseller, really brought attention to this convergence between physics and mysticism.
Do you feel that within certain traditions of Eastern mysticism, they are actually methodologies for the application of transpersonal principles? What I mean by that is through the emphasis upon selflessness and losing the self within the disciplines of yoga and meditation, for instance, do you feel that that is an acknowledgement of the principles of transpersonal psychology and an actual methodology through which the individual can transcend his own biography and enter in to a new type of worldview, a new relationship with the world around him or her?
Well, I think what is significant is that, you see, transpersonal psychology is somehow inconceivable without the recognition of non-ordinary states of consciousness, which means that in addition to the theory of transpersonal psychology, you now also have to have technology that somehow makes it possible to open up the world of observations. You see that the conceptual framework of transpersonal psychology discusses.
Right.
Otherwise you would have everyday type of experience and transpersonal theory that is totally
Right.
So you have to go into meditation, or you have to use experiential type of psychotherapies, or you have to do trance dancing, or use psychedelic plants in order to access those kinds of realities, those kinds of experiences, or those kinds of observations that are somehow the subject of transpersonal psychology. So in all these ancient spiritual or Oriental spiritual disciplines, you always have a technology, and then you have the theory. And those systems that are really good would tell you, don't believe the theory unless and until it's confirmed by your experience. So that in the first place it offers you the technique. Go and do these things, and then you will have experiences that will make you understand what the theory is talking about. I would like to address more specifically the question of the relationship between quantum physics and psychology. Because if you look at it historically, you'll find out that the traditional psychology was really directly derived from the Newtonian type of thinking, based on Newtonian principles, and also on the findings of some of the other Newtonian disciplines. So the basic paradigm is that somehow we are living in a material world. The basis of the world is matter. Consciousness is an insignificant accident, something that sort of developed after billions of years of evolution of this inanimate matter. It also developed in a very insignificant part of the universe. And another basic assumption is that consciousness critically depends not only on matter, but on a specific form of matter, which is a highly developed central nervous system. So it's a concept really of consciousness contained in the skull. And the idea that other people are sort of separate Newtonian entities, and the only way we can communicate is through some kind of known forms of energy in this context. Then if you do the experiential work with psychedelics, without psychedelics, or if you look at the findings of disciplines like thanatology, the experiences of people who come close to death, and so on, you discover a lot of phenomena that simply cannot be understood or interpreted in this context. Like there's increasing evidence that people who die clinically and are being resuscitated have an experience of consciousness detaching from the body, precipitating somewhere near the ceiling, and then from there watching the whole scene, so that after they're brought back to life they can describe exactly what happened, who came through which door, how many people were involved. They can draw the gadgets that were used to resuscitate them, like the cardiac defibrillator and so on. And according to Ken Ring and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and other people who had been blind in this situation can actually visually perceive and describe the situation. We have seen a number of instances that in transpersonal experiences people would get instantly new information about a phenomenon that they are experiencing. Become an animal and suddenly understand a lot of things about the animal. Experience an event in another culture and get instant understanding of the architecture, costumes, ritual form, or sometimes bringing historical details. Okay, so we are facing a phenomenon that simply cannot be explained in the Newtonian framework. What is now important is that most of the disciplines in science are using the Newtonian framework as a kind of mandatory framework for science. You see, and what people like Fritjof Capra have emphasized is that physicists themselves have really by far transcended the Newtonian framework. But physics became so complicated that the scientists in the other disciplines cannot catch up. So they're still sort of ruminating the old Newtonian truths, which, you know, the Newtonian laws are very easy to learn in high class, in high school physics. So they're still sort of hanging on to the Newtonian worldview as the scientific worldview. Now, what happened in physics is that matter is not indestructible anymore, the way it was in Newtonian physics, where the atoms could not be divided any further. Atomos means something that cannot be cut, cannot be divided any further. Atoms first disintegrated into kind of little planetary systems, where in the middle there was a nucleus and there were electrons whirling around it. Then the nucleus disintegrated, there were protons, neutrons, and so on. Then with high energy physics, you have hundreds of subatomic particles. And then the physicists, of course, ran into the dilemma that you were mentioning, that these particles in some experiment appear to have wave-like properties. So we have the wave-particle dilemma in physics. So suddenly what appeared to be solid Newtonian matter is entirely empty. Where there appeared to be discreteness, separateness, there are no more boundaries. So the whole universe of modern physics now is seen as a kind of unified web of events or relations. And there's an increasing number of physicists who believe that what really is the connecting principle in this web is consciousness itself. So that paradoxically, in the analysis of the physical world of matter, any traces of Newtonian type of matter, solid stuff in the ordinary kind of pedestrian sense, really totally disappears. But what does not disappear is something that is much closer to consciousness or thought, which is the idea of order, the idea of a pattern, of form, of equation. See, so that in that sense, this world suddenly approaches more and more the world of the mystic. Now, when physicists were trying to somehow understand this paradox, one of the people who were very much interested in it was Niels Bohr, one of the founders of modern physics. And he tried for a long time to find some visualizable model that Einstein always wanted. You see, what is that entity that can manifest sometimes as a particle, sometimes has wave-like properties? And then he finally gave up, and he formulated the so-called principle of complementarity, meaning that if you want to understand what matter is, if you want to understand what light is, because the same wave particle paradox is also in relation to light, the photon. So if you want to understand light, if you want to understand particles, subatomic particles, you have to accept that they are both waves and sort of discrete material entities, that these are two aspects of the same phenomenon, and then actually which aspect manifests in a particular experiment depends on the arrangement of the experiment, and through this really on consciousness of the observer, the understanding, or the preconception of the observer. Freudian says that if you arrange the experiment so that you ask a particle question, you get a particle answer. The experiment will tell you that you're dealing with particles. If you arrange the experiment and you ask a wave question, it confirms that you're dealing with waves. Now, Niels Bohr wrote books where he was suggesting that this is possibly a principle that will appear in some other scientific disciplines. It's just a precedent, the first time when science has to learn to live with a paradox, does not have a nice, visualizable, reasonable image of what it is dealing with. But he suggested that this will appear in other disciplines. Now, what we can say now is that in psychiatry, in psychology, in psychotherapy, in anthropology, in thanatology, that we have somehow a situation that parallels this. So you cannot extrapolate from the quantum domain to human beings. You would be jumping too many levels. But there's a precedent that one very advanced scientific discipline has to live with the principle of complementarity, which involves a paradox. And you can say that we have now accumulated in these disciplines that study human beings similar kind of controversial material that somehow cannot be integrated in an easily imaginable, logical way. That up to this point, most of the scientific disciplines have studied human beings as kind of Newtonian objects or biological machines. And in Freudian's terminology, they have been asking only the biological machine type of questions, and only experiments geared towards confirming that aspect were really permissible. But now there's increasing evidence from, again, modern consciousness research, thanatology, anthropology, the things that I was mentioning before, that is confirming the findings or the claims of so-called perennial philosophy, or the great sort of spiritual philosophies of the East, that somehow human beings are also unlimited fields of consciousness, transcending time, transcending space, transcending linear causality. So that in order to understand what it is to be a human being, you have to accept that we are biological machines, Newtonian objects, which is a very real aspect of us, but that also in some other circumstances or some other experimental arrangements, if you want to put it that way, we can manifest properties of a field of consciousness that has in principle, no boundaries. So what that would mean is that we have these two aspects which also have two corresponding broad categories of states of consciousness, the kind of ordinary everyday state of consciousness, which portrays reality as being kind of where matter is solid and space is three-dimensional, time is linear. But then you have the reality of the unusual states of consciousness. I call it actually holotropic mode of consciousness. Holos means whole, and trapein means to aim towards or moving towards something. The ordinary state of consciousness I call holotropic. Hyle means matter, so that would be matter-oriented. The other one is a state of consciousness that's moving towards wholeness, towards the totality of existence, where you can become anything in the universe, including the whole universe itself.
Good. Thank you. Thank you, Stan.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Voices of Esalen. Today's show is produced in conjunction with Cheryl Frenzel, Terry Gilby, Shannon Hudson, and Greg Archer. Our theme music is by Nico Holloman. You can find all of our podcasts on your favorite podcast player, as well as at esalen.org. The Esalen Institute is a nonprofit organization. Our show is made possible by your contributions.